This is unSILOed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here with Amy Edmondson, who is a professor at the Harvard Business School and also the author of a couple books. The most recent book is called Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well, which is in many ways an elaboration on the themes that you wrote about in the Fearless Organization, which is subtitled Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Now, of course, this term psychological safety has penetrated far and wide into the discourse of business. And we'll talk a bit about kind of maybe, uses and abuses of that term. But this book, Right Kind of Wrong, I mean, in many ways, what you're doing is you're setting up almost a taxonomy of failure, almost like a encyclopedia of failure, a guidebook to failure. And, here in Silicon Valley, we love to talk about failure, right? Fail fast, fail better. And there's an entire kind of failure industry that has arisen. And, in many ways, it's not terribly academically respectable, and it's not terribly well thought through. And it sometimes just seems like a exercise in affirmation. And so I was really glad that you were able to put some teeth around this concept. And, you're not saying that failing is always good, right? I mean, in fact, most of the book is really about how to avoid failure, right? And so I think that was the part that I really liked. And so, I think when you say the right kind of wrong, it also implies that there's a whole lot of wrong ways to be wrong. And you talk about the difference. So the other thing I didn't realize the extent to which this whole line of thought originated in your PhD work, right? And the kind of the origin story of this work in psychological safety goes back to that moment. So I was wondering if you could maybe start off by just recounting that story, because it's so fantastic.
Sure, you're absolutely right. And maybe not to put too fine a point on it, but all of this work, for me anyway, was born of a failure, right? It was born of a failed effort to support a hypothesis. Now, the hypothesis was pretty straightforward. So I was invited to participate in a medical team of people who were quite interested in the newly discovered, shall we say, phenomenon of medical errors. So this was in the early 90s. And this was really the first time experts were starting to talk about the fact that, like it or not, day in and day out in, hospitals around the world, people were getting hurt by what they at least assumed in some cases to be preventable errors. And so it became a kind of a topic of study. And I was invited in. I knew nothing about medicine or nothing about hospitals, really, but I was invited in to help address a sort of subset of this issue, which is, does better teamwork contribute to lowering error rates, right? It's a logical hypothesis. It's a logical assumption. It was born out of work that had been done in aviation that had shown a very clear relationship between better teamwork in the cockpit and fewer aviation failures. So far, so good. And I had a well-established, robust survey to work with that was able to measure team properties of people in workplaces. I started with that. I felt pretty confident about the validity of that survey. And then meanwhile, I did that in month one of a 6-month study. Meanwhile, trained nurse investigators were making sort of daily or every other daily visits to these teams to collect data on the errors, right? And all I had to do was wait and be patient and then run the correlation between my team attributes and their error rates.
Now, the key thing is that you did not have a sort of a ground truth for error rate, right?
Well, we didn't know that going in, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise we wouldn't have done it that way, right? So there was the assumption that because there's a big study, NIH funded, all the rest, that people who were on board with what the study was doing and would be kind of accurately reporting their errors. Well, when you step back and think about it, that's not necessarily the best assumption, right? That would be easy to do. But what's more interesting is that it may be, not only is that not easy to do, but that it's easier for some people than others. Now, I think we look back on this now, that's 30 years ago, and say, well, of course, right? Of course it's easier in some groups than others, because we now understand very deeply that groups can vary in their sort of interpersonal climate, as it were, right? The openness, the willingness to speak up, the willingness to take risks, like admitting an error or asking for help when you don't know what to do, right? We now recognize that as something that can vary across groups at work. But at the time, there was a rather naive assumption that error rates would be reasonably easy to measure in the context of formal research. And that, my little part, which was, hands off, people fill out a survey, I get the data, and then I'm just simply going to connect my data to the error data and look for a relationship. And indeed, there was a relationship. Unfortunately, it was in the wrong direction. Right? The data, my teamwork data, sort of saying the better teams, better led teams, had higher, not lower, error rates. And so that was, disappointing understates it. I thought I was going to have to drop out of school, right? I mean, that's a little bit of a naive thing to think, but it was how I felt at the moment, right? But the insight that came out of this study, unexpectedly, was that in fact, even in organizations with very strong corporate cultures, the climate across groups can vary substantially. Like just the simple degree to which people feel okay speaking up candidly with truthful statements or concerns varies a lot. And that I later called psychological safety. And now we have a big and robust literature showing all sorts of positive outcomes of having that kind of psychological safety, that kind of permission for candor in your team is a good thing. But then it was just a failed study, right? Where I could not make the same claim that had been shown, especially in simulators in aviation, that, better teamwork led to lower errors as teams. But I could say, at least there was a possibility that this climate factor mattered, and maybe future research could look into it, which indeed I then spent quite a bit of time doing. But it's there's a lot going on in that story. And one of the things going on in that story is this kind of interest in error, right? And the Silicon Valley mantra, fail fast, fail often, at least it honors the spirit of something very important. Well, two things. But one is, of course, in new territory, you've got to try stuff that might not work. But the other is you've got to learn, and you got to learn fast, and you got to keep learning. And errors and failures, which I do not believe are synonymous, but errors and failures are really rich territory for learning. Unfortunately, we don't often do it very well, right? That there's a whole lot of room for improvement there.
Well, I mean, part of the book is not just about kind of organizational failure, right? But it's also at the individual level, right? So, so setting aside the organizational context, I mean, as individuals, we are, not only risk averse, but also unwilling to acknowledge and confront error, right? We have a bias that leads us to ignore negative feedback and glory in positive feedback. And I guess, I've asked this question of a number of other researchers. It doesn't seem functional, right? I mean, it doesn't seem, it seems like it's antithetical to the kind of learning that you would need to survive in a social environment, or not even in a social environment, but in a, you're on a desert island, right?
Right.
So how do we explain that? I mean, I've never really gotten a good explanation. I mean, I know there's this idea of like it's ego threatening, but that sort of seems like a redescription of the phenomenon rather than explanation.
No, I think it's that we can get away with it, meaning we can get away with caring more about ego, caring more about what others think of us, and trying to, put on a facade that's a good to give ourselves a good reputation, to be liked, to be admired, to be seen as someone who doesn't make mistakes, which of course is nonsense. We all make mistakes. Like that we can get away with putting that first, and the things that we are not learning as a result can remain invisible to us and to others. But so we never have the alternate path. Like we don't have easy access to how good we could have been had were we more willing to learn from our failures, more willing to own up to our mistakes. And we often don't get very good data on, whether someone actually doesn't like you very much because you're coming across as a know-it-all or as a flawless person. And we instinctively don't really like those people. Mm-hmm. We want to be those people, but we don't like those people. So there's a kind of tension that's there all along. Now, if we were really, in a way, the modern human, our survival is much more dependent on sort of getting other people to approve of us and, hire us, keep us in the family, what have you, than it is, on a desert island, you're right, we would not do very well, right? Because we aren't good enough at learning from the mishaps to kind of quickly course correct and get on to the new thing. And I shouldn't say we collectively, all of us, right? Because this is another one of those factors for which there is significant variance, right? Mm-hmm. Some people are much better than others. Thomas Edison famously said, "I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work," which sounds like a very cheerful, and I think we have to accept that it was a rather cheerful acceptance of the things that didn't work, because the passion and the excitement about discovering the things that do work is so strong.
Right. So part of that's about seeking out failure in your individual endeavors. Part of it's about seeking out, feedback, right, from others. You mentioned that you said that that psychological safety is an emergent phenomenon. Sometimes you're discussing psychological safety within a hierarchical organization, right, where the danger is, that the leader shoots the messenger. But then there are other contexts where it's more of a collectivity or a flat hierarchy. In the hierarchical situation, is it more up to the leader to create the climate, or does it still make sense to refer to it as an emergent phenomenon?
Yes, yes to both. So
Okay.
I think it's hard to argue with the idea that leaders, someone in a hierarchy who has more power or status, has more influence on the psychological safety. They have more leverage to be able to sort of change that environment for others and with others. And at the same time, anyone can do and say things that'll make a difference, right? By merely sort of asking some thoughtful, earnest, creative questions, you're sort of generating that energy and that voice that is what we're actually looking for. And by acknowledging your own sort of ignorance on something, hey, I haven't done anything like this before, would love to have your help. You're helping the whole team respond in a slightly different way because you took the risk. It matters. It makes a difference. So both things can be true. I think any one of us can make a difference.
One of the examples that you use is this electric maze. Now, I want to know where do you get this thing? I looked for it on Amazon because I want one of these in my classroom. And I'm surprised that I hadn't heard of it because I would have thought that some of my colleagues would be using this in their leadership classes. But, when you describe what happens there, it's astonishing, right? It really is astonishing. Maybe you can describe it and then tell me where I can get one of these things.
Yeah, I'll have to. We got them. Meaning I used them years ago at a company I worked with, and then we brought them. I brought it over to Harvard Business School, and we here at HBS we have about 7 or 8 of them. It's kind of a substantial thing. It takes a lot of room in your closet, if you will. It's about 9 feet by 6 feet, and it's kind of, you can roll it up, but it's pretty heavy because it's got some wires in it. It's a gray carpet with a grid on it, 6 squares by 9 squares. And it's wired up so that some of the squares make a beep when you step on them and other squares don't. And the task that you give a team is to find a path of contiguous squares from one side to the other side of the maze that don't beep. They look identical. So the only way you can find that path is by stepping on squares to see whether or not they beep, right? And when they beep, you have to sort of step back and start again. And so it's a little bit of a memory task, but that's where the team comes in. Like the team's job is to sort of collectively keep track of what we've learned, what we don't yet know. And so that part actually isn't as hard as you might think. But what ends up being hard, kind of emotionally and socially for people is not replicating the bits we've already learned, but coming to the front line. And of course, the further you get into the maze, there's 9 rows of it. The further you get in, the more the pressure kind of builds, and people stand on the front row, right? The territory where we haven't been before. We just don't know. Nobody knows. And everybody knows that nobody knows. And then you have people with 1 foot midair sort of pausing like the stork, unsure where to put that foot down. No, I mean, understandable. Nobody knows. But of course, the rational, logical thing to do is just step. Maybe left to right, right? Just step, get the data. But there's all this time lost, which ends up harming the performance of the team. All this time is lost with that hesitation. So in the debrief, I ask people, and anyone, they'll generally deliver a similar response. Like, what were you thinking when you're on the carpet? All those eyes on you. I don't say all those eyes on you, but what are you thinking when you're the walker, the pioneer trying to find that next step? And it's one of 2 things. I didn't want to make a mistake, right? That's where the hesitation comes from. I didn't want to make a mistake, or I didn't want to let the team down, which is sort of the same thing. And they are misunderstanding getting a beep with making a mistake. It's not. Yeah. It's new data, right? It's literally, I use that as a metaphor in life, a beep going forward. If you've never tried something before, if it's a blind date, you name it, and it doesn't work out, it's a beep going forward, right?
Right, like the beep and the non-beep provide the same amount of information, right?
Right. I mean, the beep is simply information. It's simply data. But we are not very good at thinking of, the data we didn't want, the being wrong kind of data, as valuable. We don't value it emotionally equally the way we value being right. And so there's this aversion. It's really a kind of emotional aversion and then a social stigma of being wrong. And so people act in a way that's irrational and gets in the way of solving this sort of simple puzzle quickly because of that natural sense.
Well, you mentioned also that the bystanders, right? They will cheer when they step on a square that doesn't beep, and then they'll kind of be disappointed. Right. So that probably, that's reinforcing the whole thing, right? So did you ever kind of, I don't know, have some Confederates cheer on the people that get the beeps and see if that changes the behavior?
That's a good idea. I think that would be a lot of fun to try. I mean, I don't think it would take people too long to catch on with of course, it's just data, right? It's
right.
If we want to crack this code, we've got to get all the data as fast as possible, no hesitation, right? The one thing you don't want to waste time on, in a way it's the only thing you have control over, is the hesitation time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these, of course, are situations where the stakes involved are relatively low, right? I mean, you're not. This is not a landmine, right? Where you step on the thing and it blows your leg off, right? But there are situations where failure could be, very costly, and the key is to distinguish. And I think one of the points that you make is that in Silicon Valley, sometimes fail fast is mistakenly means don't do your homework, right? Don't do your preparation, right? And that seems that's clearly an error. And I remember, I don't know if you used the Carter racing case in any of your classes, right? You know,
I don't, but I know it well. I use instead an actual transcript where everybody knows what we're talking about. Instead of tricking them, I just use the actual transcript of the Challenger launch decision the night before the launch, and just sort of take it apart. Like, what's going on here? What are people thinking and feeling? What, you know, how are the power? Because you can really see very clearly how the power dynamics start to play out, and there's no real inquiry. There's only advocacy. You know, it's a non-learning conversation.
It's astonishing to me. And spoiler alert for anybody who's listening who hasn't done this, but you know, I mean, I walk around the classroom with a sheet of paper in my hand that has like all the relevant data, and I'm like, anybody have any questions? Anybody want any more? And they're like, no, leave me alone. I'm like working on this. Right? And
That's right.
Yeah. So I mean, is part of it about, I mean, I think you articulate how context is important. You have, by the way, I'm an aficionado of 2x2s, as is any business school instructor. And you have some wonderful 2x2s, you know, in there that I really like. And you know, one of them has to do with safety and standards. And I think a lot of people who misunderstand psychological safety say, oh, if you just allow people to fail all the time or point out failures and you applaud it, then you're basically lowering your standards. And, you know, people need to feel responsible and accountable for the errors that they make. So how do you kind of disillusion people from that confusion?
Yes, it's such an important question. And my least favorite sort of misconception of what psychological safety is that it means a lack of accountability or a lack of high standards, or it means anything goes, and we're just going to be soft and, you know, wrap everybody in bubble wrap. And it's not what it means. It means permission for candor, right? It means permission to take risks, and hopefully most of those risks will be smart risks. But how I explain this is these are two not in practice independent, but in theory independent dimensions, right? There's the dimension of how much do I believe candor is acceptable around here? Is this the kind of place where we are direct and open and quickly ask for help when we're in over our head or not? And then there's another dimension, another sort of managerial or leadership dimension, which is, what do we aspire to do? What are the standards? What's our quest for excellence? Is it high or low? And my argument is, not only can you have both, you in fact need both. And the higher the uncertainty or complexity or interdependence of your work, the more that's a true statement, right? The more knowledge intensive, the more your work requires ingenuity and judgment and collaboration, the more you are dependent on both high psychological safety and high commitment to excellence. And I call that upper right-hand zone the learning zone. But in an uncertain world, it's the high-performance zone as well. And most people get that, right? When you start explaining it, it sort of is a light bulb moment, right? Where there is, in fact, oh yeah. Like if you think about the times you've done really well at something or accomplished something challenging or great, you sort of think, yeah, I was really motivated. I really wanted to do well. And I really felt kind of unencumbered in terms of being truthful, bringing myself forward with my colleagues. You know, this is especially true for collaborative tasks.
Yeah, I mean, one of the images that I liked was the spectrum, right, where you go from blameworthy to praiseworthy error, right? And, you know, obviously they're intentional error, right? Sabotage. Yeah. That's not something that's like, yeah, way to go, you know,
really right?
But if you run an experiment where you discover something or you discover what doesn't work or what's not true, then, you know, that's something that you should be praised for. And I thought you by forcing people to, you know, draw the line, I think you said everybody has a line and they just disagree on where that line is drawn.
Right. And it's just the importance, the reason I draw that spectrum, you know, sort of a spectrum of causes of failure, not types of failure, but causes of failure. Like something goes wrong. What could it be? Well, it could be someone ran a really thoughtful experiment, didn't work out as they had hoped. Great, applause. Or it could be, someone just sort of deliberately mailed it in, did a lousy job, and it failed. Now, we're not so happy about that one. And of course, we have to find out, which one it is and then respond accordingly and help the people involved accordingly. And my main point with that is, and I'll ask people, in your organization, what percent of the things that go wrong are caused by what you believe to be blameworthy acts? And of course, they'll say precious few, right? But most of the people in my organization are not waking up in the morning looking for ways to sabotage things, right? So that's just not the typical cause. And maybe they were too tired, et cetera, right? And then I say, well, what percent of failures get responded to as if they were caused by blameworthy acts? And then that's another light bulb moment. It's like, oh, yeah, there's a gap there, which again is a gap between reason and kind of spontaneous reaction and emotion.
Yeah. But I think, one of the points that you're making is that this strategy of blame shifting, right? I mean, it is a successful strategy in dysfunctional organizations, right? Because if you
yes.
volunteer, if you say, yeah, that was my problem, I screwed up, then and it's almost like the leaders of the organization are like, this is great. Now I know whose head will roll, right? Thank you for offering yourself up as the sacrificial victim, right? And so it's clearly a dysfunctional strategy in a dysfunctional organization.
Yes. Well, it depends. It's a functional strategy in a dysfunctional organization, because right. if your goal is to keep yourself safe, to keep yourself being seen in a positive light rather than to serve the customer or solve the problem, etc., it'll work for you. But of course, no leader of an organization wants it to be full of those kinds of people doing that kind of activity. So the operative word there was dysfunctional. It is indeed dysfunctional.
Yeah, one of the points you made towards the end of the Fearless organization is that, like, everybody thinks that the problem is one level up, right? So, it's like, hey, I got to do this to survive because that's what my boss expects. And then the boss will say, well, I got to do it because this is what the shareholders expect. I mean, is that just self-deception? I mean, at what level can you safely try to change the culture?
It's natural human instinct. It's natural human behavior to look up, right? Maybe in prehistoric times, our very physical survival depended upon, say, the leader of the group, the tribe, what have you. If they liked us, if they found us a sort of pleasant human being, they kept us, and we were sheltered and fed, right? But so I think we have this very deep instinct to pay attention to what's happening above us. And oftentimes, because we're a little judgmental, we will decide that what's happening above us is suboptimal and they don't get it. And they're not doing their part to create a, psychological safety environment or a learning environment. And I say that may very well be true. And your responsibility is simply to take a look at what you can do, right? Look down or across instead of up, right? Because you can't easily change them, right? But there's so much you can do where you sit to change the little environment that you work in. I mean, that well-placed question, that kind of compliment you give a colleague, that voice of appreciation, that humble statement like, I've never done this before. All of those things matter, and you have no ability to shape the whole organization. So just shape your team, and that you can do.
Yeah, I think sometimes in business school, we don't teach both sides of the coin, right? So sometimes we teach how to persuade, but we don't teach how to be persuaded. We teach how to, maybe give feedback, but not how to take feedback, right? I mean, do you think that, we need to rebalance how we are educating the kind of next generation of leaders?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's such a, the leadership doesn't even exist without followership, right? So we've got to be as interested in what everyone does to kind of co-create value. And some people are in higher levels of leadership than others, but we're all trying to kind of create value for the customers. And I do think we have an overemphasis on sort of the role of those on the top, and all our case studies kind of tend to emphasize those folks. So we could do more, but we can especially do more to keep reminding people of the things they can control, which start with number one, your behavior. That's sort of the number one thing you can control, is how you show up. And even that's not easy, but it does matter, right? It can make a world of difference. And two, I think we need to think less about organizations and more about teams, because organizations are just made up of teams. And if every team does its part, whether it's developing the strategy, deciding on an acquisition, building a product, designing tomorrow's products, right? Every team does its job in the most learning-oriented, ambitious way possible. The sum of all those activities will be pretty powerful.
Yeah, I love how you told the story about your son who was skiing, and you confessed to wanting to yeah. I mean, you confessed to like showering him with praise when he didn't want that, didn't need that.
No.
So I mean, what did you do before? I mean, you had to have done something before to create a son who was had that hunger for criticism and for advice on how to improve.
Yeah. So I should say it was a moment of great sort of awakening for me. And I will say, so Nick was about 8 years old, and he's, skiing down the slope. He said, "Mom, will you, go to the bottom, go a little ahead and then watch me come down and then tell me how I did?" "Sure," I said. So I stood there and down he came. Neither of my two sons were particularly expert at this sport, but they were keen learners. And he got down to the bottom. He said, "How'd I do?" I said, "You did great." And he looked at me. He looked at me with immense disappointment, which was like, that was the aha moment. He said, "Can't you tell me what I didn't do well so I can get better?" And I thought, oh my gosh, the kid has been reading Carol Dweck. But of course he hadn't been. I had been. But I just wasn't paying attention to her very good advice. So what Nick was illustrating, and he really did seem to have it at an early age, was a growth mindset. I mean, he was always interested in the opportunities to do better, whether that was, math or reading or kicking a ball around the yard, whatever it was. And I can only say, I think I was very aware of Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, and I did my very best to kind of emphasize process, not outcome. That's, gosh, the colors in your painting are very interesting, rather than beautiful painting, right? That sort of just get the kids to focus on process so that they're engaged in the substance and not just waiting around for end state praise all the time, which is debilitating for them, right? Because then they start to get addicted to it, and then you can't take risks. And if you can't take risks, you'll never be a scientist, that's for sure. And you also may never be a fully functional, thriving human being. So I was aware of her work. I wasn't 100% consistent, but I think I did enough of it to nurture it. I also think with having an older brother, just 2.5 years older, who just was naturally better at things, led Nick to be a real learner.
Mm-hmm. Now, once you get to a certain age, I mean, it's, when you become a manager, or, I mean, you're teaching in the MBA program. You often are teaching people in their, mid to late 20s, as am I. And, MBAs sometimes have very sensitive egos, right? And, they don't like being...
No, they don't want to be wrong.
They don't like being, critiqued or disagreed with, particularly in front of their colleagues. So how do you, does Harvard take a kind of coherent and strategic approach to inculcating this sense of openness to feedback and criticism? I mean, how do you implement psychological safety within the classroom? Because I find that my students, they're very uncomfortable critiquing each other, and that to me is super. I'm super worried about them, because it means that they're going to encounter some rough waters when they get out into the workforce.
This is such an important point. And I think we do our best. I'm sure you do as well. Like, we're swimming upstream, but we're working really hard at helping people learn from their own and each other's shortcomings, not just, showing off to prove how smart they are. Mm-hmm. And I would say I do this in two ways. And one is the intellectual way, which I'll come back to in a second. And the other is the kind of experiential way. To a certain extent, the case method teaching is an experiential way, because people they are required to participate, right? They must raise their hand and offer their point of view, which, may or may not be like a really great comment. And over time, again and again and again, they get feedback on those comments, both by what other people say and do, and also by what happens in the subsequent conversation. Also,
it's like a flight simulator.
It's like a flight
right?
simulator,
yeah.
Exactly. I think of the case method as a safe place to make mistakes, and I do often frame it that way. I will say, we will not be, no stockholder. I mean. Stockholders or stakeholders of any kind will be affected by what gets discussed over the next 80 minutes. No money will lose hands. No lives will be lost, especially for teaching, cases from NASA or the hospitals and so on. So this is a place where we can experiment and take risks. So do it here, right? Do it now, so that you can internalize the principles of taking those risks and learning from failures. You're also, by definition, learning vicariously from other people's failures and successes, right? So you get sort of good at that. But the intellectual way I try to bring in as well is I assign an article that you may know called Teaching Smart People How to Learn. It was written in 1991 by Chris Argyris, published in Harvard Business Review. And it's an absolutely magnificent article on this exact point that you raised, which is the high achievers, the kinds of young people that we teach, are sometimes ironically, the most allergic to failure, because they've had nothing but success. And in that article, he says something like, because many professionals and, MBA students, young consultants, young finance professionals are almost always successful, they have rarely experienced failure. And because they've rarely failed, they haven't learned how to learn from failure. And so when something does go wrong, we'll all run into problems at some point, they are very defensive, right? Very good at quickly, cognitively blaming someone else. So we look at this article, we look at it closely, they recognize themselves, right? How can they help it? Because they're exactly the high achievers that he's talking about. And it's they can appreciate, because they're not in the hot seat in that moment. They can kind of appreciate that, yep, they're in that camp. And Argyris describes the fact that the programming they've put in their heads over time, this kind of is it's explicitly non-learning. Mm-hmm. And it is not going to help. It's gotten them this far, but it won't help them get where they really want to go. So they have to be able to really relearn how to learn.
Do you think that there's some domain segregation? Because, some of the folks who are most averse to failing in, say, their professional lives may participate in athletics, right, where they are failing all the time. How do people maintain those separate views of failure, or do they? Do people who are averse to failure in the business world try to stay away from those hobbies? I ride horses, and I fell off just the other day, and if I'm not falling off, I'm not trying hard enough, right? I know that, and you learn that from sports, right?
Yes. Well, there's some evidence. I don't know how robust it is, but there's some evidence that people who participate in sports, especially team sports, but I think any kind of sports, are less allergic to failure, right? And more, just a little bit, they have a little bit more of a robust failure muscle, right? Because clearly if you're in sports, you're failing all the time. You're failing some percentage of the time.
There's only one champion in every, well, I don't know.
Champion, you know,
maybe not anymore. Maybe everybody gets a blue ribbon.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. In the pediatric sports, they're all getting the blue ribbon, but once it starts getting real, not everybody is going to win. And when you learn, I mean, when you sort of have to come to terms with, I failed to win, but I still am here, and it's okay, and it was kind of fun anyway. Like, I love my sport, or what have you. Right? So you get more experience than the folks who've been purely academic, who oftentimes just really haven't gotten a bad mark ever, right? And then they at some level they then get more and more likely to shield themselves from failure. And of course, at some point that will catch up with you. But in the interpersonal realm is where they may be the least likely to learn, because they're not going to get valid data on the impact they're having. Right. So nobody kind of comes up and says, you know, you really rub people the wrong way. You come off like a know-it-all or whatever. More often that conversation, when it's happening, is happening, you know, behind closed doors. And so you're not getting the data you need to really learn and grow.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about being a strategic, doing strategic failure, intelligent failure, and you have these different steps.
Work too, right?
Yeah. Well, you talk about having a failure strategy, right? I mean, should we, seek out kind of the failure boundary, right? I mean, I have a friend who's a venture capitalist, and all of his investments were successful, and he was losing a lot of sleep over it because he hadn't yet found the kind of failure boundary. I mean, I love the 4 steps or the 4 requirements for intelligent failure, and it in many ways does represent the best of the kind of scientific approach.
Exactly. Right? You know, if you stop to, if I say who does intelligent failure well, and then I'll tell you how to define it. It's scientists first and foremost. It's inventors, innovators of any kind. They're the people, anyway. So those are sort of the quintessential designers, maybe. But here's the definition: new territory, right? It's in new territory, meaning there was no recipe that you could look up on the internet. It's in pursuit of a valued goal, right? You believe there's a chance here to make progress towards something you care about, and that, you might be wrong about that, but you certainly believe that. Number 3, you've done your homework, right? You're not just wildly throwing darts at the wall. You're testing a hypothesis. And number 4, and this is one that's often missed, especially in your neck of the woods in Silicon Valley, as small as possible, right? Just big enough to get the data you need, right? No need to waste resources on a failing course of action. It's got to be just large enough to sort of find out what works in this new territory. And of course, the bonus 5th criterion is you learn from it. That's what makes it intelligent. And there's no avoiding it, right? So intelligent failures, of the 3 kinds of failures, are the only ones that are technically not preventable. It can't be prevented because nobody knows, right? Nobody anywhere on Earth knows the answer to that puzzle. Well, I suppose if it's in your personal life, or if you're a little kid learning to ride a bike, someone knows how to do it, but you don't know how yet. So you've got to go through it to get to the other side.
Well, it's amazing how much these 4 steps line up with what I teach in my venture capital class, right? Because, the best venture capitalists, this is exactly right what they are coaching their founders to do, right?
Perfect.
I mean, you want to go out and aggressively pursue information, right, and insight, but you want to do it in the highest ROI possible, right? Which is really what, making the failure as small as possible, as small as you need it to be in order to learn how to pivot, right? And I love the word pivot because it's a sort of a euphemism, right, for failure. It's a loser idea. Oh, okay, pivot.
But its focus is on the focus is on the next step rather than on the back. Right.
Now, the other 2x2 that I really liked was the one that I I don't know, Charles Perrow probably never had this 2x2 in his book, but
He has the
extracted it.
2x2, but not with the names I put in the quadrants. Right. So he
Yeah.
has the 2x2 of interactive complexity and tight coupling, or
Hmm.
tight and loose coupling. And he was making the point way back when, in the very early 80s, that if you are in the zone of high interactive complexity, I mean lots of moving parts with sort of complex relationships to each other in your system, and tight coupling is present, which means that, flicking a switch will irrevocably lead to a reaction you can't stop, quintessentially nuclear power. Then that's just a very, very dangerous place to be. So you should sort of shy away from designing systems with those two properties. And I was intrigued by that 2x2 back in graduate school because of this problem of medical error. I thought, well, if if hospitals have high interactive complexity, and they do, and tight coupling, we're screwed. But what I realized upon deeper thought is that the coupling is quite loose, meaning if you write a wrong order and you're the physician and I'm the nurse who's going to take it to the bedside, there's a whole lot of room right there for me to catch and correct your wrong order. Or the pharmacist fills the wrong order again. There's usually so many steps and interactions that each of those is an opportunity to disrupt, right? It's not a machine that sort of makes it just happen. So the danger zone, I figured, isn't really where healthcare lives. So I labeled the other quadrants to try to clarify what they mean.
Yeah, and the it seems like much of what we teach in business school is for the managed zone,
Yes.
right?
And the
And
negotiated zone, those two, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
and yet I think if we were to, I don't know, survey the business landscape, those zones represent, I think, a much smaller part of the business landscape than they were in the
Yes,
past.
it
Right?
is
And so
true.
like, Six Sigma is, one of those techniques that kind of works well in the managed zone. It kind of doesn't work very well in the other zones.
No, you're absolutely right. And we just, in a way, we're still not effortlessly comfortable with the fact that we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, right? We act as if we live in a kind of routinized, predictable world. We act like if you walk into a big company and you hear people saying, you better make your targets or else, we sort of think of that as a reasonable thing to say,
Mhm.
rather than an almost absurd thing to say, because we just don't have a crystal ball. Like, we know what yesterday looked like, but we have only a limited view of what tomorrow will look like. And so that's, it's like we have to rewire our brains a little bit
Mhm.
to be more comfortable with uncertainty, therefore also more comfortable with fallibility, our systems and our own, and act accordingly.
I think it's safe to describe you as a connoisseur of failure, right? I mean, you have some great stories, right? The Torrey Canyon story, which I did not know about that story.
Devastating.
But there are so many that you didn't include that you could have. I mean, I always
Mhm.
talk about Notre Dame, right? Which is, we go back and you find all of these little things. If this little thing was done differently, if this little thing was done differently, but I think one of the points that you make, I mean, you have a bunch of wonderful points, is that we tend to maybe impose too much of a cost on false positives, right? And this is one of the lessons that I talk about with Notre Dame, is that I'm willing to bet that nobody in the French government sat down and did a cost benefit matrix of what's the cost of a false positive, what's the cost of a false negative. Like, if they were forced to articulate the cost of a false negative, then they would have allowed for many more false positives, right? But
Right.
usually you get judged for the false positives because that shows up in your budget. And I think the same thing happened with Deepwater Horizon and a
Yes.
number of these other scenarios.
It's another one of those things that I'm never quite sure whether it's human nature or organizational nature or a terrifying mix of both. But it is the normal, natural, undermanaged or underled organization is subject to that bias whereby we do not reward false positives. You know, a truly well-led or learning organization knows how to value the false positives. And I think the classic example here is the Toyota andon cord. I mean, I think many people are familiar with the andon cord, which is this cord by the assembly line that allows any team member to pull that cord when they suspect a potential problem might be affect the quality of that car. And, you know, and then that, you know, famously stops the line. Well, it actually doesn't stop the line instantly. It stops the line, or you pull the cord, and then a team leader comes along very quickly, and together you look at the thing you've just identified. And if you together decide, nope, that is a problem, and don't pull the line a second time, the line will stop, right? But here's the magic to me of Toyota is that 11 out of 12 pulls are recognized to be not a problem. Right. So only in 12 pulls, only one of those pulls actually leads to a line stoppage, which is great news because then they correct the problem and that beautiful little car goes down the line and all is well. But the other 11 are what we might call false alarms. Most organization, the false alarm is either punished or quickly bored of. Right. But at Toyota, it's kind of, you are praised for having pulled because it could have been something. And so it's like you feel good. You feel almost, you know, you feel heard, you feel valued. And so there is no diminishing of that desire. The same is true in some other industries. I've looked at some rapid response teams in healthcare where, again, you treat the false alarms as a great drill. Wasn't that a great drill, everybody? Right? Yeah. We learned how it would be if that had been a real alarm. And then we go back to our desks and we're, you know, hey, we got a few steps, whatever, right? It's all good. It's framed as good, but not because these are weird people, but because the culture and the leadership have gone out of their way to make sure we're framing the false positives as the valuable experiences that they are.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of analogies to ideas, right? Because I mean, most ideas are not good ideas, right? And so I talk a lot about idea culture versus complaint culture. And if you view an idea as a complaint, then, you know, your objective function is to minimize complaints, right? Which means you're basically minimizing ideas. And so, you know, I tell my students the difference between a complaint and an idea is in the eye of the beholder, right? And and that's what I liked about how you said you got to start with, you know, reframing. Right.
Reframing. You know what? You brought up Notre Dame, and I wish I had used that. You know, I didn't think of it. It's an absolutely spectacular story, and of course, it's much more modern and current than Torrey Canyon, but it's the same idea. Lots of little things. Yeah. And you know, I'm thinking now. I've been thinking about this a lot because, of course, the book is done, right? So I can't fix the book, but what's the value? I've been asking myself in kind of continuing to collect a rich repertoire of failure stories. And I've decided the value is real, right? That I won't stop. Just because the book is written, I won't stop. I will keep collecting them. So send them along, right? Because they're all fun to analyze. I don't mean to be, you know, whatever the word is, unsympathetic to the horror of some of them.
Right. Like failure porn, right?
Right. They're worthy, right? They're worthy of analyzing. I think the more we take a cool, cold, hard look at them, the more we help ourselves avoid the preventable ones and just increase the good ones, right? So the whole Silicon Valley fail fast, fell off. And it's not that it's bad, it's that it's incomplete and a little bit superficial.
Yeah. I mean, Silicon Valley Bank is another great example. I mean, I think we'll learn more. The historians will dig into it. But for me, as somebody who teaches a course on banking, and we spend the first, you know, month of the course on duration, it's impossible that there weren't people at the bank who are looking at the balance sheet saying, hey, this is not right. You know, I took banking 101 in school, right? But you know, what was preventing them from, and I don't think it was
psychological safety. I mean, yeah,
it could have been fear, but it's also, I think, you know, there's a sense of like conformity and team cohesion is sort of a more, I guess, surreptitious form of,
absolutely.
You don't want to rock the boat. It's not like people are going to punish you, but
No,
they're just going to be
you're
like,
not going to get fired.
why are you being a negative Ned?
Right. An executive I interviewed long ago, just a situation like that, didn't speak up about a concern that he had around a very important decision, an acquisition of another company. And later on, in doing this sort of post-mortem of the big expensive failure, he came clean. He said, I had doubts, I didn't share them. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, I didn't want to be the skunk at the picnic.
Yeah, right.
Which is just a wonderful
I love
image, right?
Yeah.
And it's wrong-headed, right? Because it's what I would call the wrong mental model. When you have a dissenting view, you're not a skunk, you're a treasure. And when you're making an important decision in a team, it's not a picnic, right? It's like hard work. It's not a social event. And so when you have the wrong mental model, like, oh, this is just a kind of a cool in-group and I want to stay cozy and part of it, you're not going to be actually doing the job you were hired to do. But I also think that was a failure of just plain old imagination, or maybe better yet, risk management process, right? How hard is it to say, hey, just for fun, what if interest rates go up?
Yeah.
I mean, that's in your domain, right? That's not like thinking of something impossible or weird. That's very much the kind of thing you should be doing on a monthly basis. And then you do the thought experiment and you go, that wouldn't work, would it?
Now, you mentioned this term post-mortem, and, this is something which hospitals do. Certainly, people in aviation do this, and there's been some talk of doing this in financial services, and they also talk about kind of pre-mortems and, red teaming, all this sort of thing. But when it comes to post-mortems, when is the right time to do it? I mean, because you don't just talk about the corporate life, you do talk about personal life in your book. And I think that when there's a misunderstanding or a mistake, some of us are tempted to address it right then and there. And oftentimes people don't want to deal with it right then and there. They want to kind of deal with it later, but then later becomes never. So,
Right.
When is the right time to do postmortems?
I doubt there is a best answer that would cover all circumstances to that question. But I think the conceptual answer is you need a little bit of distance from it just to be more analytical and less emotional. Now, I don't know if that's, a day, a week, a month. It may depend on the magnitude and type of failure it is. But the rule of thumb would be, when do we believe we probably have enough data and enough perspectives to get useful learnings from it, right? We've sort of collected the people together or what have you. And because you don't want to waste time. I mean, you don't want to wait so long that you meanwhile are at risk of producing similar failures along the way. You don't want to do it so instantly that you just have no ability to kind of think analytically and coolly about it.
Talk about the recovery window, and you also talk a bit about kind of, kicking the can down the road if you have a high discount rate. But I wanted to just end with a couple questions about, academics, because, we talked about what makes for good science, but even in the scientific world, in the academic world, like, we don't really reward failed experiments, right? They don't get published.
No.
Do we need to do more to reward dead ends? Do we need to encourage? I mean, we don't give someone tenure for coming up with a whole bunch of brilliant experiments that didn't work. Right?
Right.
I mean,
Well,
right. If you had gone, if you hadn't been able to pivot you managed to completely reinvent your thesis. But if you had just ended without the next stage, I don't think you would have gotten very far, right?
No, it's true. And to be sort of sober-minded about this, not everyone will survive as a scientist, right? And because in a way, both emotionally, emotionally you have to learn to live with all the failures, but also intellectually you have to be coming up with enough supported hypotheses, right? And in different fields, that'll be a different percentage. But let's just say Jen Heemstra, who I talk about as a chemistry professor, a chemist at Emory University. She claims that 90% of the experiments in her lab end in failure. My husband, who's a molecular biologist, claims that 70% of the experiments in his lab end in failure, right? And who knows if these are exact numbers, but I think they're roughly right. And they're both at the top of their fields. It's going to depend, but you have to develop those sort of failure muscles. And do we want to reward those failures? I think emotionally and socially, yes, right? When someone in the lab has a failure, you've got to reward it in group meeting. You've got to talk about it and go, wow, Greg, thank you so much. That brought all of us some really good insight. Now we don't have to do that one. And then you help Greg figure out, what's the next thing that's worth trying? Like, what should we tweak? Where's the pivot here, right? Because he can't just sit there and wallow in that failure. He's got to run the next thing. But you don't want to run the next thing just willy-nilly. It's got to be thoughtful, once again. So I think we need to reward it socially because you're doing the good work for the team. We probably aren't going to ever reward it, with pay or with, kudos for, wow, what a beautiful failure. The way it really gets rewarded, scientists whom I talk to say, is that 30% or that 10%, right? That each of those failures was, in fact, a stepping stone on the way to some brilliant, earth-shattering discovery, great paper in a top journal, or a cure to a disease that used to not have a cure. Those are reward enough, right? And people who are good scientists understand they could not have arrived there without the failures along the way.
And then a last idea is, you talk about systems thinking and how important it is. Where do we teach that in the curriculum? How do we make sure that, particularly in business school curriculum, I mean, obviously medical school needs it, law school needs it. I mean, architecture needs it. Everybody needs systems thinking. We don't have a department of systems, right?
I don't think we do enough. I think where do we do it currently? Well, we often will back up in analyzing an organization to show how the whole is more than the sum of the parts. I use the example of 3M and their, literal innovation machine that they have created. And it's not just one thing. It's not just a CEO saying, hey, we really love innovation. It's sort of giving people time. It's creating seminars, creating opportunities for laboratory experiments that aren't on your regular day job, right? I mean, it's a whole bunch of things that together add up to more than the sum of the parts. We teach that. We don't do a good enough job of teaching the simple point of every, we teach, if you do this, it gets this good outcome. We rarely stop to say, how does this outcome maybe feed back to, affect the cause, right? We don't teach loopy thinking.
Feedback loops.
Yeah, and we don't teach feedback loops very well. We also don't do a good enough job to ask people to pause and think, how will this affect future, activities of this organization, and how will this affect other people in our ecosystem, right? So that sort of who else will be affected and what will happen later are questions that don't spontaneously occur to us, but we could do a better job of teaching that.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining me. These books, again, I highly recommend going back and taking a look at the older book, right? The Fearless Organization. It's a classic. And then also this one, Right Kind of Wrong. And I'm sure if anyone has the chance, they should go enroll in one of your executive education programs because it's nothing better than listening in person. Thanks so much, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight talking with you.
This is unSILOed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.